Hi, so as is traditional at BlizzCon, along with all the other games, World of Warcraft had a Q&A panel. As is slightly less traditional, of course, there was no random questions coming from the audience. They were all pre-selected. But that doesn't mean to say that there weren't some interesting questions in there. So what I've done is I've picked out the questions that were not only interesting, but actually got some sort of answer in response, whether it be a positive one or a nothing's going to change one. And that's what I'm going to do in this video, to discuss those ones. Of course, there may be some other things emerge because other people at BlizzCon would have carried out their private interviews. So over the next week or so, those will emerge as well. I'll catch up later. So first of all, I'm going to tackle leveling. Leveling is something I've talked about for a long time, is wholly unsatisfactory. When they introduced the idea of zone scaling, that was a big plus. It didn't go as far as I wanted it to go. But the bottom line is, at the moment, leveling takes far too long. And the biggest problem I have with it, I've said many, many times, is most of the time when you get a level, you get nothing at all for it. Someone actually said something like this in the question. They were basically pointing out that you can go multiple levels without even getting an ability. And they said, why not just condense that into one level that takes the same amount of time, but at least you're getting an ability each level. That would be better. I'd still rather they didn't even do that side of it, but that would be a lot better. So what Ian Hazacosta said was that they are not satisfied with the leveling at the moment. Now, he did start to entertain the notion of a level squish. When this was asked, when they announced for BFA, we're obviously going to get the item level squish as well as the stat squish, he did broach the subject of a level squish, and he basically said, technically, no. He said, because it is true, the item level squish and the stat squish caused an awful lot of problems that took them some time to fix and sort out. The worst of them they fixed fairly quickly, I suppose, but there was some things still hanging on some time later. And he said, if you thought that was bad, you wait and see what would happen if we had to do a level squish. So he was discussing that there would be technical issues with it that basically make it too scary to do. However, now he seems to be talking about it as if it is something that's feasible. So maybe the tech guys have said, well, you know, yes, it's going to be challenging, but if there was a real compelling argument, we could do it. Either that or he's just saying it. So what he said was, yes, it's not. He agrees that it's not good to go to multiple levels without getting something. But what he wanted, he said, was feedback on what people would think of this. And he put it from the point of view of what would people think about it if they suddenly logged in one day and they've lost a load of levels. As if he's trying to put the idea into people's heads that it wouldn't be a great thing. So that's why I'm not sure about this. Is it a genuine request for feedback because now they're thinking, well, maybe we could do it, and they're seriously thinking about it? Or is he still dead against it, but he doesn't just want to say, no, I'm dead against it. I'm going to say, well, I'm going to leave it up to the community to say, so that he, and then plant an idea in people's heads that make it sound a bad thing, so that he can say, well, you know, when it came to it, people said it'd be a bad thing. When you log in, you lose a load of levels. Is that bad? No, it's not if you're in the same point of the game. I mean, if you log in and you're halfway through, say, Wrath of the Lich King leveling, which at the, okay, there's parallel zones now with the scaling, but that traditionally you would think is, what, about level 75? If you lost a load of levels and all of a sudden you were back to vanilla leveling, yes, that would be bad. But if they squished it such that whatever level you were at, you were level 75 before, wherever you are now, you can still pick up the quest in the same zone you were in because you're still in that bracket, then no, it wouldn't be an issue at all. And in fact, if they put zone scaling throughout the whole game anyway, apart from the very latest stuff, then it still wouldn't be an issue. So I don't think people would have an issue with that at all. I don't think people cherish their very high level. I think, you know, and it's got to come at it from the view of new players. Or even players wanting to roll another character for the Heritage Arm or something like that. But most especially for the new players. Because if they did do as the questioner suggested and still, well, take the same amount of time but fewer levels, I mean, I wouldn't be in favour of that. But at least it would, for someone coming into the game new, not seem as much of a mountain, because it's just the sheer number of levels that makes it sound horrendous, that I think would be really bad. So anyway, I mean, we have to take them at face value. We have to suggest that maybe they are coming round to possibly thinking about it, in which case, get your feedback in. I'm going to provide feedback and say, no, we should have this. And it should be a severe squish. I mean, the ideal situation would be like a lot of MMOs do when they're thinking long term, which would be to say, actually, you should only have so many levels anyway, and then you have like a paragon system after that. But it doesn't sound like they're entertaining those thoughts, at least. Next one, when it comes to RNG, tackling the RNG, again, the questioner made the same mistake a lot of people do and just talked about it as if it's a quantity of RNG, and it's not. What they really mean is it's a type of RNG, but never mind that. It came through anyway. Ian Hazakostas, to his credit, basically made sense of it, which is to say that there's not enough determinism in you hunting gear out. You know, there's always RNG in there. There was always RNG in the game. But you knew if you did a boss or whatever, you did a piece of content enough times, you were going to get that piece of gear. Now that's not the case. He did particularly point to the Mythic Plus cache because, as he said in that one, the loot table that your weekly cache draws from is massive. It's gargantuan, in fact. So your hopes of effectively trying to farm a piece of gear through that piece of content, which, let's face it, unless you are a Mythic Raider, or a very top-end PvP player, I suppose. I don't really know about that side of it. That is your best gear. That's where your best gear is coming from. If you're actually just a Mythic Plus Dungeoneer, your cache, because that's set at like 10 item levels above what you're going to get from a 10 dungeon. So that's where your prime bits of gear are hopefully coming from. And that low level of determinism, as Ian Hazakostas called it, and I'm glad he called it that, because that's exactly what the issue is. So what he talked about is nothing hugely positive about it. Obviously, we know now that they're going to change the system for getting the Azerite gear. That's a huge step forward. But he didn't talk about that. But what he did talk about was potentially streak breaking. So, you know the situation where you get your item from Mythic Cache and it's a crap thing. It's a trinket that's no use to you. But then a couple of weeks later, you get the same bloody trinket again. This huge loot table. And you keep getting the same item. Or it seems to be you're getting the same item. He did potentially talk about some way of improving that. I mean, it's probably not an easy thing to do. I'm not quite sure what they would do about that, because you potentially have an issue where you got an item that was actually quite good, but you only did like a +5 that week, and maybe a few weeks later you're doing +8s and you get high level. You would have actually liked that trinket at that higher item level, and maybe streak breaking would then present you getting it. So I'm not sure that's what I would focus on myself. Because although it might please the people who are sick of getting the same useless item, because they always do a +10 anyway, and you know the item level is always going to be the same. Whereas it could work against people who don't always do the same level key each week, and might actually want a repeat of an item at a higher item level. Don't know. Next one, in terms of Azerite gear, he seemed to crap on his own work here. So he shat on his own design. So he talked about the fact, he actually paraphrased like an imaginary Blizzard player, a World of Warcraft player, going about the Azerite pieces. Oh, I've got the Azerite armor now. Oh, these traits. Oh, yeah, one of them's linked to my spec. Yeah, I guess I'll pick that one then. Thanks a lot, Blizzard. Basically dumping on the original design of Azerite gear. Not even the original design, the design that went live. But he's emphasising the fact that in 8.1, of course, the Azerite gear are going to have more options for that. So you're going to have like a couple to choose from for your spec. And that's like a better system, which, yeah, okay, it is. It's good. It gives you more choice. More likely to get the trait you actually want, I suppose, as well. But it just seemed to me, we already knew about that anyway. They'd already talked about that. It just seemed to me a strange thing to say. You know, if he was talking about it purely in terms of an improvement to a system, that's how I would have come across. I know I criticise him enough for the designs, and I criticise that design as well. But come on, basic PR here. Don't say that the current design is shit. Just say, well, the current design was pretty good, but we've had an even better idea, so we're going to make it even better next patch. That's how you're supposed to come across it. Anyway. Right, GCD. Some positive movement. A little bit. So, the question was asked, are you going to take some more things off the GCD because it's taking the piss? Now, what he did is he argued that over time, there's an increasing number of abilities found themselves off the GCD. And he was talking about, on some classes they only had like 10 abilities left on the GCD. The reason for this, of course, is because we used to have virtually no abilities. Now we've got loads more. Even though there's been a few years of pruning, we've still got quite a lot compared to like vanilla, for example. And when you're talking about some classes only had like 10 on the global cooldown. Yeah, because that's where their damage abilities or their healing abilities, the ones that should be on the global cooldown. It's the other ones, your secondary abilities, utility, movement speeds, defensives. They're the ones that are supposed to be off the global cooldown. So, of course, there was an increasing number off the global cooldown because there was an increasing number of abilities added. Anyway, what they did say is they are going to be taking some more things off the global cooldown. He mentioned a warrior ability. But he did also say, which is like exciting news for everyone, that movement abilities are going to be removed off the global cooldown. That's hugely positive. They need to be off the global cooldown. They are reactive abilities. They don't affect you. You don't need those on the global cooldown. You should be off the global cooldown because it helps distinguish a better player. Because what do you have to do? If your movement ability is on the global cooldown as it is now, and not everyone's is, but mine is, and a lot of people's are, and if you know something's coming in that is just going to kill you if you don't get out of it, you have to get out extra early, which means doing less DPS. So you don't get to use any sort of ability to fine tune it and get out at the last second. No, you're going to get out plenty early. So that's a lot better. And I hope that at some point pressure is put onto them so that they do then the same and take the defensives off the global cooldown as well, in which case it'll be fine. It'll be okay. But that's a positive. That is good. That's excellent. Next person, it was an arty question, was asking about dying and armor. And the art guy was talking about, so what you're talking about is basically tinted. He went through a number of technical reasons why it's not straightforward to do. I do have to say, though, that although I don't disbelieve them, I would point to MMOs where you can dye your gear and, the gear is decent quality as well. We're not talking about shit graphics. So I would still argue that if they are doing their armor in a way that makes it difficult to have, control over colours, that maybe they should be thinking about changing the way they do the armor. That being said, all he said was he gave a scenario, he gave a potential solution for how they could do about it. He said, well, maybe, if this was the way it was done, then we could do this. But he gave zero indication that they're thinking about it at all. So basically the answer to that is no. I think the primary reason why they don't do it is not technical reasons, because if other games can do it, they could change the way they do it. I've no doubt at all that they could easily bring a system in. And as he said, not for all pieces of game, maybe not for all. I don't expect them to go back to all old pieces of game do this. If they just did it with the newer expansion stuff, that would be fine. But the reason I think is because they rely upon recolors. He even talked about they did come up with a different system during TBC in order to bang out armor sets more quickly of recolors of them. TBC was very much the recolor armor expansion. But I think that's the reason. I think because even now they still do rely on giving out recolors of gear as a separate piece of gear, or gear at a different difficulty and things like that. So I think that's why they don't want to give us any control over it. I think ultimately that's it. That is it. Anyway, next one on to transmog freedom question. There were some very nice questions asked, I have to say, and this was a big one. Why can't the questions on the normal Q&As be this interesting? So he was saying, can we loosen the strings on the restrictions on transmog? Which, yes, please, let us wear whatever, for God's sake. And then In Hazakast has argued about silhouettes in class fantasy. In other words, you should be able to recognise them from the type of armour they're wearing. But it's a nonsense because NPCs don't even follow those rules. Like Thrall, if you look at the Thrall model now, all right, does he look like a shaman? Does he look like a mail wearer? No, he does not. It's all an absolute nonsense. Obviously we see Anduin in Plate, who's supposed to be a priest. All of these things, and people all go on about, oh yes, but they're special characters. We're special characters. We've saved Azeroth no end of times. We're more special than Thrall. Thrall even said so. When we got the Doomhammer as a Shaman player in Legion, he went, oh my god, you've only just picked it up and you're already better than me. You know, better than all the rest of them. We've taken on dragon aspects. We've taken on titans, for God's sake. You know, we've taken on everything that it's been thrown at us. And you know what? If we're not special, I don't know who is. So quite frankly, yes, we should be able to wear what we want. So yeah, it makes a nonsense of it, the fact that NPCs can completely ignore these restrictions. They also argued, and he's undermined his own argument here, because he argued that they already have been loosening those restrictions with heritage armor, because that heritage armor is for that race, and it doesn't matter what class you are, you can all wear the same thing. But that just cuts off your own argument at the knees, because now what you're saying is, actually, it's okay for a priest to look like they're in plate if they're a dark iron. Well, why not loosen it elsewhere then? But his answer was basically no. But, you know, it was all a nonsense. I'd absolutely love to interview him with questions like this and actually ask, but hang on, what about? I would love to do this, but yeah, doesn't happen. I hope someone else did, because obviously, like I say, there's a lot of private interviews that would have gone on, little separate ones. Maybe some people would have asked follow-up questions on some of these things. Let's hope. Then someone else in the audience, basically, just really quickly here, because it is an important one, but there was no answer to it. It says, how do you differentiate between Garrosh and Sylvanas in terms of what Sylvanas is doing? They basically didn't answer that. Other than to say, I think Sylvanas would probably think that Garrosh was an amateur. In other words, suggesting that Sylvanas is doing it to a much greater degree. I would argue at the moment she hasn't really done anything significantly different to what Garrosh did in terms of, you know, in terms of scale. Maybe. I mean, you know, Sylvanas has wrecked an alliance stronghold, but then so did Garrosh. Anyway. But they didn't answer the question, really, so never mind that. Right, expansion set up as Horde versus Alliance, someone says. So when we go into do islands where we're playing against the Horde, if you're an Alliance player, or the opposing faction, basically, and the same in Warfronts, he said, why do PvP talents not activate? And the argument was given, which is perfectly valid, is that, you know, they're NPCs, you know, they just look like the opposing faction. They don't have player abilities. You know, the PvP talents are designed to help you against player abilities. Then some smart ass said, well, what about something that was announced at BlizzCon, the special version they're going to bring out of like Arathi Base and stuff like that, where you'll be playing not against enemy players, but against smart NPCs representing those enemy players. And they went, yeah. So they said in that particular case, they probably would activate, because those smart NPCs wouldn't be like the ones on the islands or the warfronts that just look like the opposing faction. They would actually be smart versions of player characters, you know, AI versions of player characters with player character abilities. As such, they said they probably would, in those situations, activate the PvP talents, but they says they're not activated. And another reason he gave, which was actually perfectly valid, I thought this was okay, you don't want to keep moving from content to content where your PvP talents activate and then they deactivate and activate and deactivate. And he said that's why in world questing or whatever you're doing out in the world, if you have war mode on, they're always active. They're not just active around enemy players or against enemy players, they're active everywhere, because it's too disorientated to keep switching between them as it is, which is fine, that's fine. So one pretty bad one, and this was pretty bad. This is the final thing I'm going to talk about. It's to do with class design. And there was a very, again, from a PR point of view, completely ridiculous thing to say. You know, someone in one of my comments actually on a video said, what about the customer is always right? And we know what that phrase used to mean something in business, the customer is always right. Even when they're wrong, and quite frequently, of course, customers can be wrong. But you are never supposed to say that. That's not to say that you automatically give them whatever they want, but nonetheless, you have to make them feel valued. You don't make them feel valued by telling them they're morons, which is pretty much what he did at this point. So the question about classes that have been left behind, that are not seen as desirable, particularly in Mythic raiding, but also in Mythic Plus dungeons. And he had particular short shrift for the shaman community, saying basically it's their fault. It's shaman players' fault that the class is crap. What he did is he said, well, quite a lot of the time there's nothing wrong with the class, there's nothing wrong with the spec, it's just perception, which sometimes it is, by the way. Sometimes it's absolutely perception. I know this as a Ret Paladin player. There's been times in this game, even recently in this game, when for the content, the top end content, it's been absolutely fine and dandy, sometimes even pretty good, but the perception is otherwise, and as a result, you're not taken. So, for example, in Legion, so we were pretty good to a point. Tuma Sargeras, we weren't really. You could do it, but we weren't good. But then Antorus, we were good again, and I mean good. But there's so many guilds who will think to themselves, well, they were so shocking in Tuma Sargeras. They didn't necessarily appreciate. A lot of guilds don't necessarily know what's coming up. So, I mean, I was looking for a guild at that time, bear in mind. It was not easy to find one. I thought, well, actually, there should be places popping up all over the place, because these people who manage without a Ret Paladin in Tuma Sargeras, surely they're not going to be without one in Antorus, because we're going to be great in Antorus. No, they were. They didn't realise. So perception can be a factor. And Ian played on this and basically said, the problem is when you look on those class discords, let's say you're someone who's thinking of playing Shaman, you go to that class discord and you just see all these memes about, the bench or being on Suicide Squad as a Shaman, things like this. Then that player will go, oh, why would I bother playing it? As if that's part of the problem. And it's not. The problem is, first of all, you can have a little bit of gallows humor when you talk about, your new class mount being a bench or being on Suicide Watch, that sort of thing. That's just gallows humour. That's just, we're in a crap situation, let's make a bit of fun of it. The other thing is, if some players will always say things like this, we had someone come into the Paladin Discord, by the way, it's hilarious, to basically say, and he basically said, in the Ret Paladin thing, do you think Ret Paladin should be nerfed? And everyone went, what are you on about? People were saying, they're barely taken in Aldir, and they're not. It's difficult to get into pugs in high mythic plus keys as a Ret Paladin as well. He says, oh yeah, but they're overpowered in PvP. This is clearly someone not playing a Paladin who wanted to prove to their friends that even Paladins think they should be nerfed by going into the Paladin Discord going, do you think you should be nerfed? So you get boneheads like this who will always think that every class that's not theirs is overpowered and their own class is underpowered. You get it a lot, of course, in PvP forums, if anyone braves those. But you can also spill over into anywhere. So there is an element of that. That's why it's not completely laughable what he's saying. It's just that what he's basically suggesting is that they get their class design right. He even said they have to overbuff sometimes. Yeah. And just, I'll leave you with this final little thought about this. So, think about how tuning takes place. So, we have already had, because getting ready for 8.1, there's a certain amount of tuning going on PTR. So, you'll have been able to read some of your abilities getting buffed, some getting nerfed. Some classes haven't had anything yet, but it will be coming. Some classes needed it more, so they had, more stuff changed, whether up or down. And before, so I know, for example, there are certain things planned for the Ret Paladin that are not evident yet because they're not up on the PTR, because they don't just have an idea and then stick it up on the PTR or announce it. They work through it, they think about it, they think how it's going to affect other things, they run it through some simulations, they take advice. The senior theory crafters of that spec, they'll talk to them, say, what do you think about this? It all gets rolled around, and then eventually they go, yeah, okay, we're happy with this, we'll give this a go, and they put it up on the PTR for wider feedback, wider testing. So what I'm saying is it goes through a certain process that will take a certain amount of time before it even goes up on the PTR. So imagine the scenario, and this scenario happened this week, by the way. I'm not going to mention any classes. Anyone who's looked into it will know. So there were a certain number of tuning, there was a tuning patch that basically went up on the PTR earlier this week, a few days before BlizzCon. And for some of this was overperforming specs, and there was some nerfs to some of the abilities. Cue massive backlash, as there is for anyone who gets a nerf. Massive backlash. 24 hours later, some of those nerfs were buffed again, or reverted, or, tuned down a little bit. Now ask yourself this. Why have they gone through all that process that would have taken several weeks of thinking about what they want to do about a problem, identifying, first of all, overperforming specs, thinking about how they can change it without putting it too far the other way, taking advice, running simulations, going through that whole process before it ever got up to the PTR, then a day later they change it all? There's only one reason. That is because the negative feedback made them go, "Oh, we better change it." And then Ian Hazacosta said at this Q&A, he says, there's a fine line between lobbying and feedback or something like that. He basically said you shouldn't just try and barrack us for changes because we're not going to pay attention to that. But he basically undermined his own argument yet again by proving that lobbying actually does work, because it has worked this week. When they bring out changes for a patch and then a day later, not a few weeks later after considering feedback and running more simulations and all the rest of it, a day later, changing it again, the only way that ever happens is because of a backlash and they have buckled under it. Simple as that. So you can't say on the one hand, you know, don't try and get loads of people to lobby us on this issue, and at the same time buckle when that does happen, because you just undermine your own argument. So anyway, there we go. We'll finish on that note. Another class design moan note. So those are the key things that came out of the Q&A as far as I can tell. Thanks very much for watching. If you made it to this far, if you've enjoyed it, then please click the like button and subscribe for further content. Share with other people who might also be interested. Until next time, I'll see you later.